Hello, my name is Clive Billenness and I'm a lay member of the General Synod of the Church of England. I'm a certified auditor with almost 30 years professional experience of auditing, and I'm also a qualified project and risk manager. I'm also an elected member of the Archbishop's Council Audit Committee, representing the General Synod. This audit committee are supposed to have oversight of the Independent Safeguarding Board.
Hello, my name is Martin Sewell. I'm a member of the General Synod, where I have taken a particular interest in safeguarding matters. I was formerly a child protection lawyer and a member of the Law Society Specialist Children Panel from its inception. My professional life spanned the evolution of safeguarding law, from the Maria Colwell tragedy in 1973 through the Cleveland Report in 1987, and I was literally in the room as every mistake was made in safeguarding practice. We learned as we went along. The secular world has learned from those mistakes, but I regret the Church has not and continues to replicate them.
The ISB was conceived because of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, ICSA, chaired by Professor Alexis Jay in 2020. At that time, Archbishop Justin Welby raised two questions: whether there should be a body to whom complaints could be made about the Church's safeguarding processes, and whether the National Director of Safeguarding should report to someone independent of the Church. Now, the Archbishop wanted these matters dealt with very quickly, since he felt that this would anticipate the likely recommendations from ICSA. So during September 2020, various opinions about how to proceed were expressed, and finally it was agreed that there should be a move towards more independence in safeguarding within the Church. In October 2020, a number of options were put forward for the creation of the ISB, with the structure of a new charity, a new organisation formed by a measure approved by the General Synod, or an interim body with only moral force, while other options were considered. Funding could either be directly from the Church Commissioners, which would need legislation, or via the Archbishop's Council, which would not. When the ICSA report was published, it did not recommend the creation of a new oversight body, but the decision was still taken to proceed to do so. And on the 19th of October, the House of Bishops also supported this decision. A project design was then obtained from a senior civil servant in November 2020, but was not pursued. We have never seen this, and we don't know why it was dropped. 4 options, including sub-options, were then put to the Archbishop's Council in December 2020. Number 1, create a body legally distinct from the Archbishop's Council, like, for example, Ofcom. A sub-option 1A. The Church's National Safeguarding Team would move to a new body, legally distinct from the Archbishop's Council. Option 2. A new organisation would take over most of the functions of the National Safeguarding Team, setting standards in safeguarding, a little like, for example, Ofsted. Option 3. A new board would be established which would effectively be a subcommittee of the Archbishop's Council itself. This would leave overall responsibility for safeguarding with the Archbishop's Council. And option 3 was the one chosen by the Archbishop's Council on an interim basis, while option 1 will be put in place by February 2022. If this plan had been pursued, an entirely independent safeguarding board would have been in place by February 2022. And in December 2020, the work to take this forward was delegated by the Secretary-General, Mr. William Nye, to the Director of Mission and Public Affairs, who had no significant background in safeguarding, but had to work to very tight time pressures to prepare a report for the General Synod meeting, which was scheduled for February 2021. Dr Wilkinson's report details over pages that many difficulties were encountered. There was strongly expressed concern from the survivor community that progress towards a fully independent Phase 2 ISB would stall after Phase 1 was completed. There were also concerns expressed by someone referred to as senior staff to one bishop, but not shared with the Archbishop's Council or the House of Bishops, that the proposed structure was incompatible with the legal obligations of the Archbishop's Council as trustees, and so could not be truly independent. An informal online meeting of General Synod members was held on the 27th of February 2021 to discuss the proposals for the ISB, but there are no notes or records of what occurred at that meeting because it was regarded as informal, owing to COVID restrictions. It then took until January 2022 to recruit the 3 members of the ISB, after which work began in earnest. Dr Wilkinson says in her report that the ISB was, in her opinion, not a separate association bound by contractual rules, because there were no contracts or rules in place between the ISB members, only between the individual members and the Archbishop's Council. So to sum up, Dr Wilkinson concludes that there was great clarity about the legal status of the ISB. In addition, the use of the word independent in the title of the ISB caused confusion because no one was really certain how the independence of the ISB and the duties of the Archbishop's Council as charity trustees would interact with one another. Then there is the whole question of the project management of this initiative. Dr Wilkinson blames the time pressures created by Archbishop Welby for what occurred. Now, as someone who has managed multi-million-pound projects and has also audited them, I consider this to be unfair. There are 3 pressures on all projects: time, quality and cost, and it's not unreasonable to try to achieve something quickly, but what this needs is a capable project team with adequate resources. Dr Wilkinson observes that the project lead was inexperienced with the topic of safeguarding, and there is no reference in her report to any funding being provided to support the project to form the ISB during the critical first months. Dr Wilkinson has recommended that as and when a fresh attempt is made to create a successor to the ISB, specialist consultancy assistance should be engaged and paid for to undertake the formation work. Today we have looked at the problems which occurred in trying to set up the ISB. In our next video, we'll consider what the consequences were of the differing perceptions of independence between the Archbishop's Council and the members of the ISB. So please come back tomorrow for the War of Independence. The numbers of the paragraphs in Dr Wilkinson's report which I'm referring to will appear on the screen below. As early as February 2022, Jasvinder Sangera, a member of the ISB, proposed to ask victims and survivors of church abuse what they understood independence would mean to them and how they would wish to see this working in practice. Also in February 2022, a paper was presented to the General Synod by the then ISB chair, Dr Maggie Atkinson, explaining that the ISB had only moral authority and would be very limited in its abilities. Bearing in mind that the membership of the General Synod had changed in the autumn of 2021 following the normal elections, and that almost 2/3 of the members of the General Synod were newly elected and had limited knowledge of what might have transpired earlier in 2021 at the informal meeting of Synod, which we mentioned yesterday, this statement about the limited powers of the ISB caused some concern. A motion to Synod to disapprove of Dr Atkinson's report for a number of reasons was introduced for debate, but this was halted when Synod member Canon Simon Butler, who had been a member of the Archbishop's Council during the period when the ISB was being established, moved a procedural motion to curtail debate, theoretically for up to the entire 5 years of the life of the new Synod. The motion was passed by a large majority, although it should be noted that both archbishops voted against the adjournment and wanted the debate to continue. There is a link to the voting record on the YouTube page for this video if you'd like to see who voted to curtail or continue the debate. In March 2022, the Church of England's National Safeguarding Group endorsed the view that only the ISB should set its own terms of reference for its work. This group then gave its support to those terms of reference, which are reproduced in full in Dr Wilkinson's report. These terms of reference included procedures for the replacement of board members. They also made it clear that the Archbishop's Council could not direct its activity nor control what it said or published. Dr Wilkinson states, however, that although there was an opportunity for the Archbishop's Council to approve these terms of reference, and it was stated to her in evidence that they were passed to the Secretary-General, Mr William Nye, to be presented to the Archbishop's Council, this never happened. Mr Nye subsequently conceded that they had taken their eyes off the ball when the terms of reference had been approved by a meeting of the National Safeguarding Group at which he had been present. Dr Wilkinson lists multiple occasions when this document could have been brought to the attention of the Archbishop's Council, but it wasn't. And the effect of this was to create a limbo situation where the ISB members considered that they were working to terms of reference, which gave them considerable independence, but the Archbishop's Council had never formally acknowledged these, even though they knew that they were being drawn up. During 2022, the Archbishop of York proposed to the Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, Dr Martin Percy, that the ISB should conduct an independent review into his complaints about his treatment during a safeguarding matter. Dr Percy ultimately rejected this proposal on the grounds of not being satisfied that the ISB was independent of the Archbishop's Council. Dr Wilkinson noted that the Archbishops and Dr Percy had different ideas about what independence meant. Disputes about independence between Dr Percy and the ISB continued through 2022, during which time Dr Percy sued the ISB for legal costs he had incurred. The judge in the case ruled that the ISB had no legal personality, but awarded costs against Dr Percy even though the ISB was not a legal entity. The court would not consider to whom any costs would be paid. Ultimately, the ISB withdrew the order for costs. And in reviewing these events, Dr Wilkinson considered that the term independent was used ambiguously by the ISB and the Archbishops, without any reference to either the ISB's terms of reference or the paper originally shared with the General Synod back in February 2021. She also considered that Dr Percy's concern about the legal status of the ISB was reasonable because submissions made on behalf of the ISB were ambiguous, making it difficult for Dr Percy to fully understand the manner in which the ISB's representation had been established or funded. In February 2023, the Advertising Standards Authority ruled that an advertisement for the recruitment of a business manager for the ISB improperly suggested that the ISB was currently independent of the Church of England. Meanwhile, during 2023, a dispute arose when the chair of the ISB's access to her official email account was reinstated following suspension over a series of complaints to the Information Commissioner about data breaches, apparently without the agreement of the ISB members, who wished to see the decision of the Information Commissioner before reaching a decision about the return of the chair. On the 9th of January, the ISB members informed the Secretary-General, Mr Nye, that they consider the decision to reinstate the chair's email without their agreement was a direct threat to their independence. A paper was submitted to the Archbishop's Council by Mr Nye for their meeting on the 23rd of January, but Dr Wilkinson notes that this made no mention of a wish by the remaining members of the board to see the decision of the Information Commissioner. At this meeting, it was also noted that the ISB had never been seen as independent. At a subsequent meeting of the Archbishop's Council on the 20th of March 2023, Mr Nye submitted a paper suggesting the creation of a community interest company to operate while a longer-term solution could be developed. The paper also noted that the ISB had been hindered by the lack of an independent legal status. The Archbishop's Council then resolved to appoint the chair of the National Safeguarding Panel as interim chair of the ISB. Dr Wilkinson notes there was no prior consultation with the other members of the ISB about the appointment, nor was any reference made to the ISB's terms of reference as they applied to the appointment of board members. In her conclusions at the end of her report, Dr Wilkinson comments that the name of the ISB caused confusion because the word independent was taken too literally by people. It also caused confusion between the ISB members and the Archbishop's Council itself. Dr Wilkinson agrees with one person whom she interviewed that the Archbishops themselves could not articulate what independence meant in practical terms. Professor Alexis Jay has now been invited to make recommendations for forming a new independent safeguarding board for the Church of England. At the time of making this episode, her report is expected to be published shortly, and it's clear that the expectations of many people, including synod members and survivors of abuse, had expectations of the level of independence which the original architects of the plans for Phase 1 did not share. Had debate about the ISB not been curtailed in February 2022, it's possible that a greater appreciation of the constraints which would apply during Phase 1 might have been better understood, since the bishop with responsibility for safeguarding would have had an opportunity to respond. Similarly, had the Archbishop's Council been shown a copy of the terms of reference for the ISB, which it had drawn up, the potential for confusion might have been lessened. What is clear is that there will be a challenge for whatever structure comes next to exercise the level of independence which is clearly expected from the various stakeholders. Today, we've looked at the differing perceptions of independence between the Archbishop's Council and the members of the ISB. Tomorrow, we will examine how the ISB was closed down in our next episode. So please join us tomorrow for End of Part 1. The numbers of the paragraphs in Dr Wilkinson's report, which I'm referring to, will appear on the screen below. In this video, I will take you through the timeline of events, mainly covering the period January until June 2023. It is slightly longer than episodes 1 and 2 because we need to carefully follow a number of threads. But the first signs of difficulties can be seen earlier in 2022, following an alleged data breach by the then chair of the ISB, Dr Maggie Atkinson, reported to the Church Data Protection Officer on the 8th of April 2022. Dr Wilkinson does not go into details about this, and therefore neither shall I. But by July 2022, the Information Commissioner had confirmed there had been a data breach by Dr Atkinson, and she stepped back from her role as chair of the ISB. A second data breach by Dr Atkinson was then reported, dating back to February 2022. This led to a number of difficulties between Dr Atkinson and the other two ISB members, which Dr Wilkinson sets out in some detail in her report. But significantly, it is noted that the Secretary-General of the Archbishop's Council, Mr William Nye, warned the members of the ISB that if the members of the ISB could not meet to discuss the matters relating to the data breaches, the Archbishop's Council had the right to impose a process of mediation or terminate one or more of their contracts. So now we come to January 2023. In a meeting of the Archbishop's Council on the 23rd of January 2023, it was decided, but not unanimously, to include a threat of termination of contracts in instructions to try to resolve tensions between Dr Atkinson and the other two members of the ISB. On the 1st of February, a press release was put out by the Archbishop's Council stating that a dispute resolution process would be started. It was not, however, until the next day, the 2nd of February, that dispute notices were served on the three ISB members, 24 hours after this issue had already been published in the media. And according to ISB member Jasvinder Sangera, when she spoke at General Synod on the 9th of July, she did not receive this until 3 days after it had been issued. A variation to the three ISB members' contracts of employment was drafted on the 24th of February 2023 in order to address information sharing agreements and to reduce the risks of further breaches of the GDPR. On the 3rd of March 2023, a dispute resolution meeting was held between the three ISB members and Mr Nye, who represented the Archbishop's Council. The meeting was supposed to be confidential, but following the publication of a report to the General Synod by Mr Nye in June 2023, all three members of the ISB issued statements during July 2023 disputing what occurred at that meeting. In the meantime, on the 20th of March 2023, Mr Nye reported to the Archbishop's Council that in his opinion, relations between the ISB members had broken down irretrievably. Another meeting with the ISB members had been arranged for the next day, the 21st of March 2023. A separate paper laying out proposals for the future of the ISB was also shared with the Council. Now, these were proposals which had been shared by Jasvinder Sangera and Steve Reeves with the Archbishops in a private meeting in York 4 months earlier, in mid-November 2022, which the Archbishop of Canterbury described as satisfactory and friendly. This paper referred to the ISB suffering from a lack of resources, a lack of proper foundation, and a lack of independent legal status. Also on the 20th of March, Mr. Nye gave an oral update, and Jasvinder Sangera and Steve Reeves also joined the meeting to explain their proposals for Phase 2 of the ISB. After they'd left the meeting, the Archbishop's Council resolved to seek the resignation of Dr Atkinson as chair of the ISB, or to terminate her contract, and to appoint ex-Member of Parliament Meg Munn, the current chair of the National Safeguarding Panel, to become the acting chair of the ISB until the end of 2023. Dr Wilkinson's report does not tell us from whom the proposal came to appoint Ms Munn as the interim chair, and we will not speculate. On the 21st of March, Mr Nye met Dr Atkinson, who offered her resignation, and he then informed the other two members of Dr Atkinson's resignation and of the Archbishop Council's decision to appoint Meg Munn as interim chair. Dr Wilkinson's report does show that Sangera and Reeves indicated to him that they felt there should have been an open recruitment process of the appointment of the new chair. On the 29th of March 2023, Ms Munn, as acting chair, held a Zoom meeting with Jasvinder Sangera and Steve Reeves. What transpired at that meeting is disputed, but it was clearly difficult. And I'm just going to divert briefly here to note that Dr Wilkinson criticises Jasvinder Sangera for allegedly making a recording of this meeting for her own personal use, referring to this as unprofessional. As a highly experienced legal professional, however, Dr Wilkinson is undoubtedly fully aware that to do this is completely permissible and legal, so we should not comment on someone exercising their legal rights. We also do not know if anyone else recorded this meeting. Dr Wilkinson says she has never heard this recording, so we do not know what was recorded, if anything at all. A formal announcement in a press release of the departure of Dr Atkinson and the appointment of Ms Munn as the acting chair of the ISB was made on the 30th of March, and it should be noted that when invited to speak at General Synod on the 9th of July, Jasvinder Sangera stated that she and Steve Reeves had been told to issue this notice, despite giving warnings that Ms Munn would not be acceptable to the survivor community. Dr Wilkinson documents over a number of pages how relationships then deteriorated over the next 2 months between Ms Munn and the other members of the ISB. In May 2023, all 3 members of the ISB asked to attend a meeting of the Archbishop's Council. At that meeting, an update from the Secretary-General informed the meeting about a number of issues, including over 50 abuse survivors refusing to share their personal data with Ms Munn. The final number, as I said earlier, was 76, and concerns from the other 2 members of the ISB being able to work with Ms Munn in the light of this response from survivors. The Archbishop's Council discussed the Secretary-General's update without the ISB members being present, and they were then invited to come in and speak for no more than 5 minutes. Dr Wilkinson notes that one survivor who attended the meeting informed the Archbishop's Council that having spoken to a number of other survivors, they did not feel safe, owing to the manner in which Ms Munn had been appointed, while they had full confidence in the other 2 members of the ISB. While Ms Munn informed the meeting that they would be willing to work with the other 2 members of the ISB, those members, Jasvinder Sangera and Steve Reeves, did not reciprocate. The following day, the Archbishop of York proposed that the 2 members of the ISB should continue to lead on the current Phase 1 of the ISB, while a separate group, chaired by Ms Munn as acting chair of the ISB, should produce the model for Phase 2. At the end of this meeting, the majority of those present felt more effort should be made to try to make the ISB work. Dr Wilkinson reports on the 11th of May, a meeting between the 2 original ISB members, the 2 archbishops and the Secretary-General, took place, and this was seen to have positive outcomes. That it was agreed that a group should be established under Ms Munn to plan Phase 2, and that it was agreed that the terms of reference to which the ISB members had been working would be looked at again by the Archbishop's Council. This led to an agreed statement being published on the ISB website on the 12th of May. Dr Wilkinson notes that Jasvinder Sangera continued to warn those who'd attended the meeting on the 11th of May that a growing number of survivors objected to their data being shared with Ms Munn. and according to her, on the 9th of July, a total of 76 survivors wrote refusing to permit their data to be shared with Ms Munn. On the 17th of May, a conflict arose when Jasvinder Sangera wrote a blog with a plan of action for a victim consultative panel for the ISB, which was posted on the ISB website and also on her own personal Twitter X account. The following day, however, Ms Munn ordered the ISB staff to remove it, which was then countermanded by Ms Sangera. Ms Munn stated that she considered this proposal related to Phase 2 and had budget implications. Ms Sangera assured her that the proposal was not related to Phase 2. Dr Wilkinson concludes that at this point, the working relationship between Jasvinder Sangera and Meg Munn had completely broken down. On the 24th of May, a Zoom meeting had been planned for late afternoon between all three ISB members, the Archbishop of York, the new bishop with responsibility for safeguarding, the Bishop of Stepney, Joanne Grenfell, and an unnamed member of the Archbishop's Council. During that morning, Mr Nye had circulated a plan for the future of the ISB. However, at lunchtime that day, Steve Reeves and Jasvinder Sangera submitted a dispute resolution notice in accordance with their contracts of employment, containing 9 complaints. The notice then proposed in detail how to address these matters. The planned Zoom meeting went ahead later in the day, but Dr Wilkinson notes only that concerns and frustrations were expressed on all sides. The Archbishop of York subsequently criticised the 2 ISB members for sharing their dispute notice with the Church Times, who reported on it before the meeting planned for that day began. And it should be noted that the Archbishop accused the 2 ISB members of acting unprofessionally, the same accusation made by Dr Wilkinson of Jasvinder Sangera when she believed that she had made a personal recording of a meeting. Dr Wilkinson does not record whether any response was received to that criticism, but it should of course be remembered that on the 1st of February 2023, the Archbishop's Council had themselves put out a press release concerning the service of a dispute resolution notice to ISB members, a full 24 hours before it was communicated to the ISB board, and according to Jasvinder Sangera, 3 days before she received it. On the 9th of July, in her address to General Synod, Jasvinder said that she and Steve Reeves had felt forced to communicate on social media because they were always silenced within and by the Church. On the 31st of May, an emergency meeting of the Archbishop's Council was held via Zoom, at which a paper was presented by Mr Nye, updating on events up to the 24th of May. The paper set out a range of choices, including an option to terminate the ISB members' contracts and a legal analysis of the contractual position. Dr Wilkinson reports that this paper also proposed interim arrangements in the event of the dismissal of the ISB members, but none of those she lists includes a strategy for dealing with the supporting of the overall survivor community. A resolution was then proposed by email to members of the Council, authorising the General Secretary to in the first instance try to resolve the dispute, but if no agreement could be reached, to bring about the closure of the ISB. It's notable that this motion makes no reference to the involvement of either the Bishop with responsibility for safeguarding, Joanne Grenfell, nor the Director of the NST, the National Safeguarding Team, in any of these actions. By 11-3, with 1 abstention, and not unanimously, this motion was approved. Mr Nye sent a very detailed response to the 2 ISB members on the 6th of June 2023, and the following day Jasvinder Sangera replied, citing the conditions in her contract of employment, which provided for the appointment of an independent expert, a mediator, to seek to resolve the dispute. This part of her contract is not included in Dr Wilkinson's report, so we cannot judge the validity of that request, and neither does Dr Wilkinson. However, Mr Nye declined to take this path. A meeting was then held on the 12th of June 2023, which is detailed in Dr Wilkinson's report, after which Mr Nye wrote to members of the Archbishop's Council informing them that he did not judge that the mediation process would be effective or timely, and that in accordance with the previous resolution, the ISB members' contracts would be terminated. Dr Wilkinson notes that while some members of the Council agreed that contracts should be terminated, a small minority urged caution, warning that the manner of the termination of the contract should be carefully planned. Even after this date, Dr Wilkinson notes that Jasvinder Sangera and Mr Nye were still exchanging emails about the preparation of an ISB report to the General Synod for its meeting in July 2023, and that the ISB members intended to attend that synod. On the 16th of June, Jasvinder Sangera and Steve Reeves emailed Mr Nye, the two archbishops and Bishop Joanne Grenfell, proposing a way forward and expressing a desire to show unity and not remain in dispute with the Archbishops' Council. 3 days later, however, the Archbishops' Council was sent, Dr Wilkinson does not say by whom, an updated plan for the termination of the ISB members' contracts. Dr Wilkinson highlights that one consideration was that it would be difficult to terminate the contracts if members were allowed to speak at the General Synod. Emails were then circulated amongst members of the Archbishops' Council about the termination of the ISB members' contracts, and by 11 votes in favour, with 8 members either voting against or abstaining, termination was approved for the 21st of June. 11 out of a total of 19 eligible votes. Dr Wilkinson notes that both archbishops wished to wait before proceeding. On the 21st of June at 12:03 p.m, therefore, letters terminating their contracts were sent to ISB members by email, informing them of their termination and stating that a formal announcement would be made on the media at about 1 p.m, i.e. about 57 minutes after they were notified. The date of termination was set to be the 5th of July 2023. And so this concludes the story of how the ISB was closed, except that Dr Wilkinson mentions one further detail which should be noted and doesn't really get given much significance in her report. The notice of termination for Steve Reeves and Jasvinder Sangera stated that the date of termination will be the 5th of July. In the case of the acting chair, Ms Meg Munn, however, Mr Nye's letter stated that in order to ensure an orderly termination of the engagement, her date of termination might need to be extended beyond the 5th of July. Now, this should be carefully noted, because nowhere in Dr Wilkinson's report is any mention made of Mr Nye being empowered to extend the termination date of one member of the ISB, and it's therefore not clear from that report under what authority Mr Nye made such an offer, nor why it was only made to her, especially since it was already known that 76 survivors had refused to consent to her having access to their personal data. Now, we'll refer to this matter again in episode 5 of the Wilkinson Files, but tomorrow in episode 4 we'll consider the apparent breakdown in governance arrangements within the Church of England in its handling of this matter. So join us tomorrow when we consider the governance gap.
The numbers of the paragraphs in Dr Wilkinson's report which I'm referring to will appear on the screen below. But before we begin our analysis, I would like to make one observation. The members of the ISB were all selected via a vigorous process including external recruiting, and they were recruited for their competence, their drive and their commitment. It's not in the least bit contentious to say that each had a proven track record of success working in that field. Indeed, 2 of them had been honoured by the Crown for their work in safeguarding. Bringing such people with such backgrounds together and integrating them into a functioning team necessitated sound leadership and above all clarity of purpose. As my co-presenter Clive Billenness put it to me, the object of drawing such people into a functioning team was to create fusion, not friction. And anyone who works in the area of safeguarding is normally very committed to understanding and following normal rules and procedures. So, why was there friction between the board members and also between them and the Archbishop's Council and also with the Secretary General, who was de facto the link man between the 2 groups, the line manager? You may recall that one of the earliest major controversies arose when survivors began to suspect that their personal information, which they thought was safely held within the ISB, was leaking across to the National Safeguarding Team within Church House. This resulted in complaints to the Information Commissioner's office and eventually to the suspension of the chair, which in turn severely reduced the capacity within the team to do its work. It was a small part-time team, and when one of its members went missing, the capacity to deliver the work was reduced. In her report, Dr Wilkinson clearly highlights the significance of the data breaches upon confidence within the survivor community, with ensuing tension between the ISB members. She attributes this problem to a failure to include data protection procedures in the original ISB contracts, which traces them back to weaknesses in how the whole project was originally conceptualised and implemented. She comments that there were serious design flaws in the creation of the ISB. These fundamental design flaws included a degree of confusion over the legal status, hence confusion over the inclusion of the word independent in the name. So what's in a name? Well, quite a lot actually, since it led to confusion between the ISB members themselves and Archbishop's Council about the extent to which the ISB would have operational independence. So now we come to the heart of today's topic. The ISB's governance arrangements were inadequate from its inception and left it vulnerable to personal conflicts between the ISB members and to contingencies. Dr Wilkinson says that the ISB members were left in an almost impossible position in trying to address disputes about this. This is the major flaw from the outset. And although Dr Wilkinson was not allowed to say where the fault lies, well, members of Synod can form their own opinions. So now let's go forward in the report and turn to the role of audit in the story. In any organisation, one of the guardians of probity and governance are the internal and external auditors. They, in turn, are overseen by what is supposed to be an independent audit committee which reports to the General Synod each year. The Archbishop's Council Audit Committee is composed of 6 members. The chair, Mrs Maureen Cole, who is a member of the Archbishop's Council, and so participated in the decision which led to the closure of the ISB. A second member of the Archbishop's Council, the Reverend Dr Ian Paul, ditto. 2 completely independent people from outside the Church, appointed for their skills in this area, and finally 2 members of the General Synod who are elected by its members, Clive Billenness, who is presenting some of these reports in this series, and one of the members of the House of Laity for the Diocese of Europe, who is also a certified auditor. There is also Chris Gill, another member of the House of Laity for the Diocese of Lichfield, who is a qualified accountant. As early as 2020, when the ISB was first being created, consideration was given to how it would be audited and therefore the role which the Audit Committee would have in overseeing its activities. Dr Wilkinson's report does not detail any conclusions which were reached, but it is apparent from subsequent events that since the Archbishop's Council regarded the ISB as one of its own creation, oversight inevitably fell within the remit of the internal and external auditors of the Audit Committee. At its meeting in September 2022, the Archbishop's Council was informed that the Audit Committee wished to commission a review by internal audit of the ISB. This was supported by the 2 members of the ISB who were present. The chair of the Audit Committee had received a letter from one of the committee members expressing concern about the data breaches, and we are told that the Archbishop's Council declined. The reason for that refusal is not stated in the report. 3 members of the Audit Committee who wrote to the chair of the Audit Committee, Mrs Cole, urging that the issue of the urgent audit of the ISB raised again with the Archbishop's Council, of which of course she is a member, but she refused to do so, saying that this would have to wait its turn until the normal audit cycle. So nothing happened. At the subsequent February 2023 meeting of the General Synod, Mrs Cole incorrectly informed Synod that the Audit Committee had no authority to conduct an audit of the ISB's operations. Appropriately challenged, she subsequently corrected this error, but then relied on an assessment by the Church's head of internal audit who is, of course, an employee of the Archbishop's Council, and this was apparently a low priority issue. Members of the Audit Committee continued to express concerns through March and May, but no action was taken, and Mrs. Cole's annual report to the General Synod in July 2023, as the ISB was being closed, made only a passing reference to the issues raised. Dr Wilkinson states that the Audit Committee were unsure about the status for the purposes of internal audit until February 2023. But this cannot be true, since she does record that the members of the Audit Committee had been pressing for an internal review for almost 6 months prior to this date, and at no time had any suggestion been made that they were not entitled to exercise an oversight role. Had there been uncertainty, this would have been highlighted as early as September 2022. Was it therefore more wishful thinking on the part of a few members of the Archbishop's Council that this supposedly independent auditing body, chaired by a member of their own council, could not look into what was happening? For reasons which we will go into in more detail in episode 6 of this series, the deliberate ignoring of the Audit Committee members' repeated expressions of concern and requests by the Archbishop Council was a key governance failure, and this contributed directly to the ultimate closure of the ISB. For this episode, however, the next issue which we need to look at is in relation to governance failure in the management of conflicts of interest. Dr Wilkinson repeatedly refers to concerns expressed that the appointment of Meg Munn as acting chair of the ISB, while she held on, or was going to hold on, to another senior safeguarding role within the Church, created a perception of a conflict of interest. In her report, it is noted that the Secretary-General stated on the 4th of May 2023 that no conflict of interest existed, but that Miss Munn would step back temporarily only from her other posts as chair of the National Safeguarding Panel and as a member of the NSSG. This should be perhaps considered in the context that whilst the chair of the NSP, Miss Munn, at a meeting on the 29th of March, had expressed her opposition to the work of the NSP being merged into the work of the ISB. Perhaps the most powerful example of the report of concerns about conflict of interest comes from Dr Wilkinson's note concerning the Archbishop's Council meeting in 2023, when an abuse survivor, Jane Chavou, who was also a member of the National Safeguarding Panel, which Ms Munn chaired, stated that having consulted with the abuse survivors, she felt that Ms Munn had a direct conflict of interest. That was a point of principle and not a matter of personal disrespect. Finally, and this seems at first sight to be a small issue, but it had a huge impact on the ISB, it should be noted that the ISB was deprived of a public contact number for 5 months because of a procedure whereby their contact number was transferred out when a member of staff at Church House, seconded to the ISB, changed jobs and took the telephone number with them. Ms Wilkinson comments that it was normal practice, but it seems to have been a monumental blunder to have not anticipated that there would be staff turnover, and that if the staff number were to be changed every time this happened, it would inevitably mean that stationery, websites and business cards would potentially all have to be reprinted with each staff moves. This has been described to me as having to change the 999 number every time a police officer moved between police stations. This raises some serious questions about what other telephone numbers might have been cut off in similar circumstances. At the end of her report, Dr Wilkinson concludes that I find that there was no design by Archbishop's Council to frustrate the ISB's work in this way, but that the governance arrangements for the ISB made by the Archbishop's Council were wholly inadequate, which had the unintended effect of frustrating their work. It also heavily criticises the failure to adequately resource the ISB throughout its existence. The well-known management guru Peter Drucker said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." This means that however often an organisation restructures itself or adopts new strategies, there is a danger that its underlying culture will simply reassert itself. It is hard to read the Wilkinson report and not have a number of serious questions about that governance culture. We will be coming back to this again in episode 6. But tomorrow, in episode 5 of the Wilkinson Files, we shall be hearing the survivors' stories. And I'm going to start by warning you that this episode is a couple of minutes longer than some of the others in the series, because it's necessary to provide you with more detail in order to bring justice to the survivor community. In her report, Dr Wilkinson gives case details from several survivors with whom the ISB became involved. They provided her with both written and interview evidence. We do not have the time in this short report to go into all of these in detail, but we will highlight several important matters. The survivor Anon 1 stated that survivors trusted the survivor advocate and the independent member because they did not prioritise reputation management over the needs of survivors. Survivor Anon 4 describes the conduct of the ISB survivor advocate and the independent member as totally appropriate. Survivor Graham Jones, a pseudonym, mentioned that some people would consider the many failures of the Archbishop's Council and Secretariat to be a conspiracy, but he believed it was more a result of incompetence, with a strong overlay of reputation management. He also emphasised the importance of the Independent Safeguarding Board and their role in serving complainants, victims and survivors. He highlighted that the ISB's conception, resourcing, powers and independence were essential to survivors, as these individuals had nowhere else to go and no allies in the Church. Additionally, he touches upon the lack of understanding within the Archbishop's Council of the significance of the ISB to such people. Dr Wilkinson added, "I heard from other complainants, victims and survivors in interview who were frustrated and sometimes confused by having to deal with so many different bodies and individuals, both clergy and staff, about their cases." Dr Wilkinson does note that there was a suggestion to her from another survivor that a desire to suppress safeguarding allegations was a possible contributing factor to the termination of the ISB contracts. She concluded, however, that there was insufficient evidence from which to conclude that the Archbishop's Council terminated the contracts of the ISB in order to prevent it bringing to light allegations that this was a contributing factor in the decision to terminate. She did, however, observe that where a body is terminated suddenly in the middle of work on case reviews, it's unsurprising that the subject of those case reviews might consider that the terminating body wished also to terminate the case review work. As a solicitor, I think it's important to note that insufficient evidence in this context is not quite the same as no evidence, and that the absence of direct evidence to Dr Wilkinson from the dismissed ISB members is a significant loss to the completeness of her report. As to why neither Jasvinder Sangera nor Steve Reeves agreed to cooperate with Dr Wilkinson's review, we note that in the report in the Church Times published on the 24th of November 2023, these two former members of the ISB had declared that whilst they had consistently called for an appropriately constituted and independent inquiry, they were dissatisfied with Dr Wilkinson's terms of reference, as set by Archbishop's Council, and they felt that these were too narrow to guarantee completeness. One case which we do not scrutinise in depth in this episode is that of survivor Mr X, upon whose case the ISB did commission a report to completion. The reason is that it's too lengthy and detailed to deal with here. You can read about it in Dr Wilkinson's report from paragraph 304 onwards. The case was the subject of protracted correspondence between the ISB and the National Safeguarding Team, and also caused some tension between the two bodies. In his final correspondence, before his contract was terminated on the 5th of July 2023, Steve Reeves wrote to both archbishops complaining that no formal response to their report about Mr X had yet been received, and urging that proper care was taken of this survivor. The letter concluded, "I would urge you to ensure that your advisors adopt a suitably trauma-informed approach to Mr X's case as a matter of urgency." Dr Wilkinson confirmed that the Archbishop of Canterbury did not reply personally, but passed the letter to his staff to deal with, and also to the staff of the Archbishop of York. She also makes the general observation that she received complaints from other survivors about being frustrated and confused with having to deal with so many different bodies and individuals about their cases. One interviewee commented that the safeguarding response system in the church enabled everyone to say, "It's not my job," without anyone saying, "Come on, enough's enough." In the pages following this, Dr Wilkinson details other cases which did not make it to full review, with which the ISB were involved to some greater or lesser extent. And so now we come to the aftermath of the decision to close the ISB with impact on survivors, as we have increasingly been hearing. On the 21st of June 2023 at 12:03, the members of the ISB were notified by email from the Secretary-General, Mr William Nye, of the termination of their contracts. 19 minutes later, Steve Reeves emailed him urging caution in making a public announcement so imminent, owing to the possible impact on survivors currently involved in difficult cases with the ISB. Were they to learn this via the media, he was worried. He also requested a copy of the public statement, which would be made at 1 p.m. Mr Nye replied that arrangements were in hand to notify ISB staff and also survivors, but asked to be informed of any specific individuals who might need to be contacted. Please note that although we don't know the time of this reply, a clock was ticking down the final 38 minutes before a public announcement was due to be made by the church. 12:42 p.m, Steve Reeves replied that persons in the ISB review process had asked that their details should not be shared with the church without their consent, and with only 20 minutes remaining, this would be difficult. He stated in his reply, "I am urging caution as powerfully as I can. The harm could be significant, and the announcement isn't urgent." The reply from Mr Nye at 12:53, 7 minutes before the announcement was made, was that in that case the Archbishop's Council would not be able to contact individuals whatever date and time the announcement was made, but that survivors who were in regular contact with the National Safeguarding Team would be contacted through the normal channels. In her review, Dr Wilkinson finds that Mr Nye did not appreciate that some individuals had refused to share their data with the church, and that he acknowledged that staff would not be able to contact these individuals. A report placed in the Church Times by a source in Church House that efforts had been made to contact individuals before termination was inaccurate. In addition, the decision not to delay the announcement of the termination was taken because there were fears that it would be leaked on social media or the press before it was formally announced. In the interest of full and accurate reporting, we now need to add some information which does not appear in Dr Wilkinson's report. During the exchange of correspondence between Mr Nye and Steve Reeves on the 21st of June, our research has shown that Mr Nye copied his email to a number of members of the safeguarding team. Dr Wilkinson criticises an answer given to a General Synod member in July 2023 by the Archbishop of Canterbury that the timing of the announcement was linked to a need to issue papers to the General Synod on time and to ensure that Synod members were aware of what was going on, as she did not consider that this answer properly addressed the question asked about the rationale for giving the ISB an hour to inform survivors groups that they were being disbanded. We must also remind you that in episode 3 of the Wilkinson Files we reported that on the 19th of June 2023, when the termination of the ISB members' contract was being planned, one consideration in choosing the timing was a desire to prevent the ISB members from addressing General Synod at the July meeting, since this would make it harder to dismiss them. Dr Wilkinson details the evidence given to her by survivors of the impact on them of this announcement. We won't detail these again here, but suffice it to say that the effects included mental distress and even suicidal intentions. One survivor informed Dr Wilkinson that he had still not been contacted by anyone about successor arrangements for the ISB on the 30th of July 2023, almost 6 weeks later. On the 25th of June 2023, the Archbishop of York gave an interview on Radio 4 in which he stated that interim arrangement survivors were in place, but corrected this at the meeting of the General Synod in July 2023. Dr Wilkinson later notes the connection between the Elliott Review, in which the withdrawal of pastoral support from survivors was stated to be unacceptable, and the termination of the ISB contracts. Although she notes that a member at the time of Archbishop's Council, Reverend Canon Tim Good, assured General Synod that the Archbishop's Council were aware of this recommendation by the Elliott Review. She could find no reference to it being considered in the Archbishop's Council decision to terminate the ISB. At the meeting of Synod, a survivor, James Chavou, criticised the Archbishop's Council for failing to listen either to survivors or to the two members of the ISB. She also referred to the termination of the ISB as a safeguarding and governance failure. Dr Wilkinson notes that at a Zoom meeting of the Archbishop's Council on the 18th of June 2023, the minutes recorded that the Council needed to learn how to speak to survivors and be trauma-informed. In the lessons to be learned, at the end of the report, Dr Wilkinson states that the way in which the ISB was terminated on the 21st of June 2023 shows lamentably little trauma-informed regard for the vulnerability of the individuals with whom the ISB were working, which I have found the Archbishop's Council members should have been aware of. In particular, the refusal to pause when that vulnerability was pointed out, which we interpret to refer to the exchange of emails between Steve Reeves and William Nye between the 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. on the 21st of June, in order that the decision should be communicated as safely as possible, was unreasonable. To sum up, Dr Wilkinson's report contains many complimentary comments about the members of the ISB from church abuse survivors who compared their conduct favourably with other experiences they had had within the church. This should be contrasted with an unattributed comment at the meeting of the Archbishop's Council on the 23rd of January 2023, where it was raised that there was a question about how much confidence there was in current members. Dr Wilkinson also makes several references to tensions between the ISB and the National Safeguarding Team, and in our report yesterday we referred to complaints about the ISB being raised verbally by the Director of the NST but not being minuted at the Archbishop's Council meeting on the 23rd of January 2023. Dr Wilkinson also notes that on the 12th of June 2023, Jasvinder Sangera complained that she had been criticised by the National Director of Safeguarding for being too survivor-focused. Dr Wilkinson does not suggest that there was any dispute that this phrase had been used by the Director, but notes that the context was disputed by him, saying it related to concerns about the relationship between Ms Sangera and survivors. Dr Wilkinson does, however, also include in her report, at the appendix, a copy of Ms Sanghera's contract, which includes specifically among her tasks to ensure that the experience and views of victims and survivors are heard and embedded within the safeguarding policy and practice development framework, and receive complaints in relation to the National Safeguarding Team's handling of cases. It's therefore very hard to see how Ms Sanghera could not, when fulfilling her tasks, communicate and interact with survivors very closely and on other than a survivor-focused basis. The Wilkinson report is highly critical of the refusal of the Secretary-General, William Nye, to delay the announcement of the winding up of the ISB on the 21st of June in the face of warnings about the potential impact upon the survivors. That warning, which in the event proved well-founded, was given in the apparent urgent desire, which was reported on in episode 3, to prevent the members of the ISB from addressing the General Synod in July 2023, out of concern that it would make it more difficult to terminate their contracts. And the fact that the 21st of June was the last date when termination would ensure that the ISB contracts were terminated before Synod met, one is left wondering whether expediency overrode caution and survivor focus. Because these films focus on the Wilkinson Review, we're not going to refer to the report prepared by psychologist Mr. David Glasgow on the impact which he observed on survivors, because it was not available to Dr Wilkinson. We will, however, look at his findings in our following programmes in a few weeks' time. In our final episode of tomorrow, we will draw together all of the threads of these 5 reports so far, which we are mysteriously entitling Magic Moments, and we hope that you will join us, and we will then leave it to the survivor, Jane Chavou, to close this episode with the words with which she addressed the General Synod in July last year in York. We and Dr Wilkinson heard Jane say,
"Many survivors have contacted me to say the church feels unsafe. In their words, what an absolute mess and carnage for everyone. How could this have happened with an appropriately regulated organisation? They have disbanded the only safety I have. My anxiety is through the roof and I'm struggling to function on a day-to-day level. I haven't felt safe since the announcement. My trust in the institutional church is now completely shattered. It is not just trust. The most difficult part is the lack of care. How can the church be like this? The damage done is beyond words. For some it will be the last straw and cause irreparable damage, not just to their relationships with the church, but in their lives, their well-being and their faith. It is not just the impact of the reputational damage, the further trauma to victims. It is the wider church feeling complicit in this, which is a moral injury in itself. The safety of the church has been impacted directly, now and for the future."
In order to prepare the Wilkinson Files, Clive and I have read Dr Wilkinson's report over a dozen times, and as we did this, we each identified what we considered to be the critical moments and decisions which led to the closure of the ISB. Moments when different decisions might have prevented the outcomes which we've witnessed. In this episode, we'd like to share these with you.
And for this reason, we've entitled this episode Magic Moments.
Magic Moments.
As we go through these today, the paragraph numbers from Dr Wilkinson's report will be appearing on the screen below me. Now, the first magic moment I'd like to raise is the failure to properly set up the project to create the ISB in the first place. In episode 1, I pointed out how Dr Wilkinson notes that the person put in charge of the formation of the project had no real experience in safeguarding, and I defended Archbishop Justin Welby against criticisms over the urgency of his desire to put the ISB into place, by pointing out there is nothing wrong with trying to deliver something quickly, provided it's resourced properly. The magic moment here was that this apparently didn't happen. There is no reference to the project having a budget or additional support resources at times when these were necessary. Dr Wilkinson has recommended that as and when another attempt is made to create an ISB, specialist external resources be brought in to deliver it. And my next magic moment is the failure to lay before, or perhaps communicate, to the Archbishop's Council the terms of reference which the ISB had agreed for itself and had also got an endorsement for from the National Safeguarding Steering Group, the NSSG, and also effectively from the National Safeguarding Panel, the NSP. Dr Wilkinson says that these were passed to the Secretary-General, but although there are multiple references to them in other documents, they were never formally approved by the Council. Indeed, she notes that in May 2023, the Secretary-General acknowledged that they had taken their eye off the ball when the terms of reference were presented to the NSSG, and that a member of the ISB staff had on the 16th of November 2022 sent a link to this document to the Secretary-General, the National Safeguarding Team, the Church Legal Department, and the Archbishop's Council Secretariat. Now try to remember this one, because it's going to feature in 2 more of my magic moments.
Can I say here, Clive, that I do not regard this as the Secretary-General taking his eye off the ball. It's more a case of being asleep at the wheel and causing a near-fatal car crash. From that moment on, the ISB members were acting in the belief that they were acting in accordance with agreed protocols, but the Archbishop's Council knew nothing about this. As a result, each side was looking uncomprehendingly at each other and wondering, why are these people acting like this? Well, now we know why. It's like the one side taking to a sports playing field, following the rules of association football, and the other team working to the rugby union code, and each side accusing the other of breaking the rules, and the referee in the middle not sorting it out. And so we come to the magic moment at the meeting of the General Synod in February 22, when our now former colleague on Synod, Gavin Drake, tried to lay a motion before the General Synod expressing concern about the status and limitations of the ISB. That debate was brought up short when a former member of the Archbishop's Council, Reverend Simon Butler, proposed a motion to move to the next business and so stop discussion of the topic. Not only for that day, but potentially that would have lasted for another 5 years. In fairness, the chair that morning explained very clearly to Synod members the implications of voting for this, but a large majority did so. Their names are all a matter of public record and on the General Synod website, and there is a link to the YouTube page for episode 1.
Yeah, in fairness, it was a synod comprising 60% of new members who'd yet to learn the dark arts of what we call gaming synod. Now, since then, several members who voted for Next Business have actually been in contact to tell us that they now regret having done so, but an opportunity was lost to raise various concerns.
Absolutely, and it's a key moment, in my view.
And now we come to the magic moment which is closest to my heart. The refusal by the Archbishop's Council at their meeting on the 22nd of September 2022 to agree to a request by their audit committee to have an internal review of the creation and operation of the ISB. And I can tell you, dear viewers, that yes, it was me that first requested this, and several of my colleagues on the audit committee, as well as both Jasvinder and Steve Reeve, supported me over this. I think this is potentially the Titanic moment, since had an audit been performed when we requested it, under standard audit practice, the auditor would have asked for sight of the approved terms of reference of the ISB, and it would then have emerged that these had not been properly shared and approved. And as a result, one of the high priority recommendations of the audit would have been to draw the Archbishop's Council's attention to this, and to insist that they formally approve these basic ground rules. It was the continuation of this misconception by the ISB members that they were operating under approved terms of reference, while the Archbishop's Council did not know that these even existed, and both believed and acted as if they had a free hand to do as they liked. Dr Wilkinson identifies the appointment of Meg Munn as the acting chair as the most significant short-term cause of the termination of the ISB contracts, and of course if at that point the Archbishop's Council had been aware of the arrangements in the terms of reference for the appointment, this might never have occurred.
So essentially, Clive, if everyone had known the terms of reference which had been agreed with them, the NSG was chaired and approved by the lead safeguarding bishop. That required a proper process to appoint a new member to the ISB. All the tension and all the suspicion just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, quite. I want to shift to an analogy of the NASA Challenger space shuttle disaster, and that was the moment when the O-rings failed. Now, we're not going to show you the explosion, I assure you, but this little piece of film reminds us what happened just before the disaster, and to me, this was the O-ring moment. As you can see, what started out as a microscopic failure very quickly grew into a major breach, which led ultimately to the loss of the Challenger spacecraft.
And this is a recurring theme. Proper professional practice, whether in audit or proper safeguarding practice, is rejected by an amateurish Archbishop's Council that thinks it knows best.
Yeah, but in fact it doesn't.
The furore about the Audit Committee's request for an audit sprang into life again in February 2023 when Synod member Professor Helen King asked at the meeting of the General Synod whether the ISB had been subject to scrutiny by the Audit Committee, and was told by the chair of the Audit Committee and member of Archbishop's Council, Mrs Maureen Cole, that it had not. She then added, and we have to say inaccurately, that the Audit Committee had no power to conduct an audit of the ISB operation, an answer she was obliged to subsequently correct on the Synod record in writing. An attempt by another member of the Audit Committee to clarify the exact situation for Synod members to understand was then cut off by the chair of the sessions at Synod, and he was prevented from obtaining an answer. And as I recall, Clive, you tried to intervene, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. If you watch the YouTube recording of the exchanges, which took place on Monday the 6th of February, and there's a link on the YouTube page for this episode so that you can see for yourself, I did try to factually correct what was being said, but sadly it made no difference.
It's always a problem to get people with the real expertise into our debates at the right point.
And now I'm going to refer to a magic moment which was in the written evidence submitted to Dr Wilkinson, but which did not appear in her final report.
Evidence submitted by?
Me. The Archbishop's Council Audit Committee met again on the 2nd of March 2023 after this debacle, and I first expressed concern that the chair of our Audit Committee should be apparently acting as an advocate for the Council. But I was told that it was not open to me as a member to question how the committee had been structured by the Archbishop's Council with a chair who was also part of the Council's decision-making process. I also suggested at that meeting that the Secretary-General engage an external mediator, and although he undertook to consider this, as we heard in episode 2, when the same thing was suggested by Jasvinder Sangera 3 months later, the Secretary-General declined to do this.
I'm actually quite shocked at this, and the phrase which comes to mind is marking their own homework. I'm also bound to wonder if the Secretary-General had listened to the requests being made for an external mediator, whether things might have worked out rather differently. This might be a good point to mention the controversies surrounding the allegations of data breaches by the chair, Maggie Atkinson. Dr Wilkinson records that based on documentary and interview evidence, I find that it had not been possible to determine in advance of the contracts being signed whether the ISB members were data controllers or data processors, because their operational relationships and systems had not been defined. So again, we have structural uncertainty, and plainly the independent member and survivor advocate placed primary importance on respecting survivor data. For them, compromising that integrity was a clear red line for preserving ISB credibility and victim confidence. So there we have another of our magic moments, and linked to it was a damaging corollary. With the controversy over the complaints against the chair, relations and the work suffered. Maggie Atkinson was eventually stood back for several months. This was a part-time outfit, and with a major player out of action, progress languished. Plainly, those with responsibility for keeping the show on the road did nothing. Two part-timers were never going to be able to take up the slack, and Maggie's primary role of developing a vision for Phase 2 didn't happen because she wasn't there. There was insufficient resource, no leadership from the church to give them the talent time which that aspect of the work required. That failure to supplement an already under-resourced ISB was crucial to the later complaint from Archbishop's Council that the ISB members had failed to advance Phase 2 of the project adequately. It's like the defendant who murdered his parents and then asked for mercy on the grounds that he was an orphan.
Now, steady on, Martin. Okay, so who's going to talk about what we agree is perhaps the biggest magic moment of all? The events between midday and 1 p.m. on the 21st of June 2023. The last chance which existed to prevent this whole story becoming a complete disaster.
Well, I will. And as we highlighted in episode 3, at 12:03 on the 21st of June, an email was sent to the members of the ISB by the Secretary-General, William Nye, informing them that their contracts would be terminated on the 5th of July 2023, which coincidentally would have been just before the General Synod was next due to meet. We talked about this in episode 3, and that a public announcement was going to be made just 57 minutes later. 16 minutes later, Steve Reeves emailed Mr. Nye urging caution in making this announcement when ISB staff and members were not available, and he was concerned about the impact on survivors' safety if they were to hear about this first in the media.
And I think we had to hear that these were already identified as victims who had been multiply abused, both initially within the church and subsequently by bad church complaint handling.
Quite. And these were people with known vulnerabilities, many of whom were known to need special consideration and care. But Dr Wilkinson tells us that Mr Nye replied to Steve Reeves saying that arrangements were in hand to inform survivors. At 12:42, Reeves responded stressing that the harm could be significant and the announcement isn't urgent. I think we emphasise it was not urgent. 11 minutes later, Mr Nye replied that even if not every survivor could be identified to be informed, this would be the case whenever the announcement was made.
Yeah, now, we know that Archbishop Welby told a General Synod member in July that this timing was driven by a need to get papers to the General Synod out on time. And so at 1 p.m, the National Safeguarding Team emailed an announcement out to their press mailing list, and yesterday we heard about the impact that this had on survivors, so we need not go into that again here. But here, right at the end, was a final chance to mitigate the outcomes of the whole story. Do please note that Dr Wilkinson's report does not say that Steve Reeves was asking to delay the termination of the ISB contracts, only the announcement for survivor-centred reasons.
And she heavily criticises the events of 21 June 2023.
So here we have lots of moments where the failure of the ISB could, in our opinion, have been prevented. But they weren't.
Well, Clive, you and I have spent many hours poring over this evidence and summarising it. We now leave it to those responsible for the future of safeguarding in the Church of England to decide how to avoid making the same mistakes again.
Yeah, that's right. If this was an air crash investigation, I think the final verdict would be that there were multiple pilot errors.
But it's not for us to decide who the pilot or pilots were and whether they should ever be allowed to fly again.
Yeah, we leave that to you, the viewers.
And so this is the end of the Wilkinson Files.
Except it's not.
The Sheepfold Project will be producing a longer documentary in April, in which we will be speaking to some of the people involved in the story of the ISB and catching up with what has happened since Dr Wilkinson published her report. So join us soon
For the Wilkinson Files, the sequel.